Hello, this is Peter Adams, the director of ALP, the Accelerated Learning Program at the Community College of Baltimore County. We prepared four fairly short, each one's less than 10 minutes, videotapes to familiarize people with why we developed ALP, what it is, and what its results are. So in the first videotape, I'm going to talk to you about this, that's the one you're watching now, about the problem that ALP was designed to address. The next video explains what ALP itself actually is. The third one is the data video. We'll explain the results we've achieved at the Community College Baltimore County with this program. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the costs. This is the videotape that you may want to take to your administrators because it makes the argument, and I think convincingly, that ALP is actually less expensive than more traditional programs, even though it involves fairly small class sizes. So let's start with a little discussion of the problem ALP was designed to address. Let me start by saying that I've spent my adult life working in developmental education, and I believe, and I think lots of you watching this video will agree, that if what you're really concerned about in education is the American dream, is the idea that people in America, if they were willing to work hard and apply themselves, can get ahead, can be successful. If you believe that people who've had a rocky start in life, whether it's their own fault or because of societal situations, that they deserve a second chance, then developmental ed becomes the most important part of higher education. It's the crucial part of higher education if what you're concerned about is social justice. However, developmental ed is in a really precarious position today. There's more attention being paid to it than ever. Foundations are making large grants to improve developmental ed. The federal government is interested in it. And most of our schools are paying a lot more attention to developmental ed than they have in the past. Part of the reason for this is that there's been a lot of data produced showing that developmental ed, as we've been doing it for the last generation or two, actually is producing results that are not nearly as good as most of us who are working in the field had hoped for. For example, the Gates Foundation reports that 3/4 of students placed in developmental courses do not receive a degree or a certificate within 4 years. The Community College Research Center, CCRC, and if you don't know this organization, go to their website, just Google CCRC. They produced an enormous amount of data on studying what we're doing in community colleges. There's a study there on ALP you might even want to take a look at. But anyhow, they report that few students referred to developmental education progress through their sequence of courses to succeed in college-level courses within 4 years. Only 45% of students in the study successfully completed a course in college-level English. Now, some years ago at CCBC, actually back in the early 90s, I decided that I wanted to know how well our program was doing. And so we had created a database on an Apple IIe computer, and I used that database to try to evaluate the program I was in charge of. And so we took a look and we found that 57%, we looked at all the students who took English 052, that's our upper level developmental course, in academic year 88-89, and this was CCBC now has 3 campuses, but at that time we were 3 separate colleges, and so this was just at one of the colleges, Essex Community College at the time. But there were 490 students who passed the developmental course. This doesn't mean they passed it the first time they tried it. I was studying these students from a perspective of 1993, so they had had 4 years to pass the course, and 57% of the students who took the upper level developmental course had passed it 4 years later, which means, of course, that 43% had not. We were a little concerned about that 43%, but we did want to know, how did those students who passed do when they took English 101? So we followed them into English 101, and we discovered that a whopping 81% of those students who passed the developmental course and took English 101 got an A or a B or a C in the course. Only 19% got what is not a passing grade in our system here. Now, what was really surprising to us is this is even higher than students who were placed directly in English 101. So for a few fleeting moments, we were pretty happy about our program. We concluded we were doing a great job. But I started thinking about that 81% and wondering how could we get it even higher? And it occurred to me in a sort of perverse way that I knew how we could get it higher if we raised our standards in the developmental course so that only the very best students ever passed English 052, then those students would do even better in English 101. In fact, if we got it down to the point, let's say we had 1,000 students one year in our developmental course, if we could limit it to just 10 of them getting out and all 10 passed, we'd have a 100% pass rate in English 101. But there was something wrong with that analysis because 990 students would have been unsuccessful. And so that led me to a different way of analyzing the data. And it's one of the points I want to make in this videotape. When CCRC, when the Gates Foundation, when Complete College America, when your state, when your school, when your IR office studies developmental programs, we really need to study the entire sequence of courses. How well students do when they finish your sequence and get into the credit course is not the crucial piece of data that you want. Here's the kind of data you want to look at. This is using the same Apple IIe computer, still looking at these students from the perspective of 1993, but looking at the students that took our upper level developmental course in academic year 88-89. There were 863 of them. And what we found, the same 57% passed the course within 4 years. But then we found this startling thing. Of those 57%, 135 of them, 16% of the original cohort, never took English 101. That is, even though they passed the course, the developmental course, they never even attempted the credit course. And English 101 is required in all of our AA programs and all of our certificate programs. So it isn't that they were in programs that didn't require it. This was just startling to us. These were not students who had failed. These were students who just dropped out of the system. And we started asking ourselves a question at that point. Why would that happen? Why would so many students, 135 out of the 490 who passed the developmental course, why would so many students drop out? We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But then we went a step further. And how did they do in English 101? Well, that whopping 81% we were looking at a few slides ago is all of a sudden has dropped down to 33%. In other words, what we discovered in this study in 1993, when we did this longitudinal study of the entire cohort, what we found is that for 2/3 of that cohort, our developmental program was serving as a gate to keep them out of the credit course, to keep them from succeeding in the credit course, rather than as a pathway to success. That was disconcerting, and needless to say, and that's the problem. That's the problem that CCRC has discovered. That's the problem that the Gates Foundation and lots of other folks have discovered as they've studied developmental programs, not only in writing, but in math and reading. In fact, math often has an even lower success rate. That's the problem that ALP was invented to address. Now, we talked about the data showing disappointing results. There's a second force working on developmental ed today, and it's the fact that in this country we're suffering a terrible financial crisis. In fact, our state and local governments are so hard-pressed that I'm sure most of you watching this videotape have felt it at your school, that state and local governments are really looking for places to slice the budget, to reduce the budget. And if you put those two factors together, the fact that on the one hand, the data show that developmental ed has not done such a good job, and on the other hand, the fact that we're desperate for ways to reduce spending, all of a sudden, developmental education seems very vulnerable, and indeed I think it is. In fact, one of the things I feel really strongly about is, while we have a great opportunity now, everybody is paying a lot of attention to developmental ed, if we don't take advantage of it, if we can't greatly improve our success rates in developmental ed in the next 5 years, that the political and public support for developmental ed is going to disappear, and we're going to find that if our budgets have been cut in the last few years, they're going to be drastically cut, if not eliminated completely, in the coming years. So whether you decide to adopt the program we've developed, ALP, or some other approach, I really urge everyone to go out there and let's make developmental ed work, partly because of this crisis in the public arena, and partially because of the crisis in our students' lives. Developmental ed is so important to the students we work with that we really have to do a better job. So a few minutes ago, I raised the question, why do so many students drop out? And we've tried to answer that. We tried surveying the students who dropped out of our courses, and that's really hard to do. I don't know if any of you have been successful, but we were not successful. We found that mostly when we tried to reach them, they had moved, their phones had been disconnected, or even if we were able to reach them, they weren't feeling too friendly towards us and were not very responsive to surveys or invitations to focus groups and so forth. So instead, what we developed was a system where we distribute surveys at the beginning of the semester. We do a survey at the beginning and the end of every semester in all of our developmental courses. But the survey I want to talk about, or at least the question, it's been on lots of our surveys that we've asked, is a sort of hypothetical question. We've asked students, if you did have to drop out of this developmental course, which of the following are possible reasons that you might have to drop out? And so in the following slides, what we're going to give you is the results, it's the information that our students told us what they think are the most likely reasons they might have to drop out of a developmental course. But before I do that, of course, as developmental instructors, we think that the reasons that students drop out are something like this. They can't write a thesis statement. They have sentence fragments. They don't know how to give concrete examples. They have trouble with subject-verb agreement. They have usage problems, or they can't follow the MLA format. When our students talked to us, they told us that it was none of those. In fact, the kinds of things that they said they were worried might result in their not completing the course were things like this. Financial problems was number one on everybody's hit parade. Legal problems, changes at work, car trouble, abusive situation where they were living, medical problems, eviction, problems with their children, they're laid off from work. We call that group of problems life happens. Life problems will interfere with the possibility of their completing the developmental course. But there was a second group of problems, not as prominent, but also worth considering, and they were things like this. Students might become discouraged or lose confidence, become depressed, feel isolated, discover they weren't really prepared for college-level work, find out they had registered for the wrong courses. Sometimes they become very stressed, and we group these under the general umbrella of affective issues. And so those are the two things that we think, the two categories of problems. It has nothing to do with the content of our courses. In fact, sometimes English faculty say, well, these are not my problems. I wasn't trained in graduate school to help students with their parole officers or to help them with their depression. And those are legitimate concerns. We English teachers were not. But that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. And so ALP actually is what we can do, and we'll talk about that in the next video. But the question that we were setting out to answer was, what can we do? And in the next video, we'll explain what ALP is and try to answer that question. What can we do to try to prevent students, or at least lower the number of students, the percentage of students who give up and drop out of our programs before completing and before getting into credit courses?